Hello everyone, and thanks once again for tuning into our latest video. Today I have the huge pleasure of welcoming Stuart Forbes, co-founder of Rize ETFs, who is here to talk about his personal passion, namely the sustainability of global food supplies, and how investors can access this theme via the Rize Sustainable Future of Food ETF. But before we start, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, it would be superb if you could. And if you enjoy the content, please show this by giving the video a like and perhaps even leaving a comment. So, Stuart, to kick things off, what is the investment case for this particular thing?
So I think what we're seeing in the food sector is a a series of changes, right, which are driven mainly by changes and anticipated changes in consumer demand, right? So what we have at the moment is this growing trend of conscious consumerism,
Mm-hmm.
where people are now they're basically thinking about what they're eating, and they're looking at two things mainly. Number one is health. So, are these things good for my health? Am I eating, too much garbage? And then the other thing they're thinking about increasingly is environment. Like, what is the impact of what I'm doing on not only the climate change and warming and the impacts that has, but also on more acute things like deforestation in the Amazon and in Borneo and places like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a poll that was conducted last year, in the US, in terms of, it was basically a poll, why have you reduced your meat consumption this year? And the two biggest reasons were health concerns and environmental concerns.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we see a huge long-term shift in some of these, like some of the aspects of the food system, and it's all driven by the consumer, and yeah, it's health and it's environment, and that's why, for example, we have a food safety and testing subsector within our ETF. So it's there to capture the companies that are providing testing solutions. But we also have plant-based foods sector, and we have an ingredients sector as well. So it's all geared towards capturing that anticipated growth, I should say, in the sort of shift in consumer, I guess, preferences for more plant-based products as opposed to meat, and we can talk about why that's important in a minute. But also, people are concerned about what they're eating. I mean, if you're talking to people, middle class people in China, for example, they're not buying baby food locally. They're shipping it all in. They're buying foreign stuff because they don't trust the local stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So what goes into what people are actually putting into their bodies is a huge driver of this as well. It's not just environment, but the two of them together create a fairly compelling, I guess, long-term case. And we're as a thematic provider at Rize, we're always thinking about the long term. Like, where is this opportunity going to be in 5-10 years time, 20 years time even? And that's, cybersecurity is a good example of that. That's probably, from a tech perspective, that's going to be the biggest story forever, because the more digital we go, the more security you need. So, we're always thinking like that, and that's how we've positioned this. And I think the key thing with this theme is it's a sustainable future of food theme as opposed to a food theme.
Mm-hmm.
And we can talk about how that's different, from a normal food theme as well. But in terms of growth areas, some of the really cool, interesting growth areas, you've obviously got things that lots of people have heard of now. So vertical farming and indoor vertical farming. This is something that sounds quite innovative and is really cool, and everyone loves it. And so we can do this in city centers and stuff like that. Actually, the Netherlands cracked this a long time ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the Netherlands are basically 20 years ahead of everybody else, right? And that one of the best examples you have of this is there's a new company called App Harvest, which is in the process of, it's not doing an IPO, it's doing basically a combination with an existing listed company. So it's an IPO, effectively, and that was announced earlier this month. And so they're this really cool sort of indoor, farming company in the US, in Kentucky, in the Appalachia. And but what they said was that, look, we haven't created some unreal technology that nobody's ever heard of, that's
Yeah.
for vertical farming, like some of these other guys do. We've just gone to the Netherlands and taken what's already existing, right? They solved all this already. So that's really cool. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from the Netherlands. They've got these underground hot springs and things like that. So everything they do there can be done on a circular basis. So even their electricity can be effectively a lot cheaper than what we would otherwise need to do to put all the lights in and everything else into a vertical farm. But we see that as a really interesting area, because it's not just that. Vertical farming at the moment is used mainly for herbs and tomatoes and things like that. Right? They grow well in vertical farms. In the future, you may be able to bring the growth of tropical fruits and all that much closer to the consumer in Europe, and reduce the the impact of having to ship that stuff all around the world. Now, something that we can touch on later is that actually the shipping in terms of emissions is negligible in the food system as a whole. So it's actually a bit of a red herring. This whole bringing things closer to the consumer is actually a real red herring and a massive misconception in terms of the impact that has on the planet. But anyway, vertical farming, very cool. People love it. People like the idea of buying local. So they like the idea of a city-based vertical farm that's producing all their greens, their basil, their oregano, their tomatoes, whatever. And so that's a really interesting area. Obviously, plant-based meats. So that's comprised of two different areas. You've got actual plant-derived alternatives to meats, like Beyond Meat. And then you've got a newer area, which is very, very sort of scientific, which is cellular meats, right? Or cultured meats, where you're actually taking animal cells and you're growing them in a lab to create either, a pile of mince meat, or even like a relatively formed steak or something like that. So actual like a mimic muscle, which is actually made of animal cells. So that's like the latest technology there. And these areas are really exciting. There's lots of growth there, and I think with that stuff in particular, you've got with plant-based meats, you can create some pretty cool products. With the cellular meats, you're actually replicating the taste and everything for real of real meat, which people will miss, right? The other thing you've got that's really interesting with this whole sort of increasing adoption of plant-based foods is, okay, well, people miss the taste of bacon and all that stuff they used to cook up on a Sunday morning, right? So, okay, maybe they have it once a month, but what do they do? So ingredients is a huge area of growth too, because, with all this plant-based stuff, you've got to make it taste good. So it's that, there's lots of areas, actually ancillary sort of areas that pick up when you see these major trends happening. And I do think that a shift away from eating meat is a mega trend that we are on the cusp of seeing. And if you look at Kearney, they've predicted, everyone's agreed that obviously the meat consumption is actually on the rise at the moment. In developed markets, it's saturated. So there's no sort of general increase going on across the board in developed markets. In developing markets, though, it's very much still on the rise. But it's predicted by Kearney, at least, that by 2025 we're going to start seeing that decline. Right, we're going to start seeing cellular meats and the plant-based meats increase, but we're going to see real meat start to decline, because you've got this combination of it's all this conscious consumerism, but you've got the health conscious consumer and you've got the environmentally conscious consumer, and those two things tend to go hand in hand, actually, and that will create a long-term sort of decline, which has all kinds of very positive implications for the planet, which we can talk about in terms of how we thought about this and built the sustainable theme. So it's a really interesting area, and many different growth areas. We have 9 different subsectors within this theme. It took us best part of 9 months to build this fund, because we really had to start from scratch. And we worked with thematic research to do all the research on on the different, I guess, areas within the food system, which is vast. I mean, you've got for everything from the technology and farming equipment to actual production to the supply chain. I mean, it's huge, right? So it touches on.
Is the conjunction, the word conjunction with thematic, is that the main differentiator between yourselves and the whole raft of other, food agriculture based funds, be the active, be the passive? Is that the main driver?
So, well, certainly it's a real differentiator in ETF world, right? Because in ETF world, most ETFs are tracking indices that have been produced by somebody else. So FTSE or stocks or Solactive or whoever, right? They will create an index and then people will track it. And all the ETF provider has to do is just create a UCITS fund, which copies the index, replicates the index. In our case, we actually build the indices ourselves. So we go because we think actually that the way that we end up constructing these indices has a stronger proposition in the end, because we go out and find people who know the sector inside out, right, or prepared to do the research on the sector inside out, and then we attribute, we give these companies a score effectively. Which reflects how much revenue they derive from that sector or the subsector within it. Rather than just going, okay, we do a word search of their financial statements and, they've mentioned robotics, so they're a robotics company, or they mention plant-based foods, which is what a lot of these indices are doing, right? They're not pure at all. And if you look at the thematic purity of a lot of these indices that are out there, it can be really low. And that does, in our opinion, not in our opinion, in our observation, that impacts performance. Because if you believe in a theme, right, if you think this theme, this sector is going to grow, you need to maximize your exposure to that sector. Just because a company's paying lip service to it in its marketing spiel doesn't mean you actually have exposure to that sector to the same degree as another company that is deriving meaningful revenue from it. So for us, that's a huge part of our process. And you can only do that. You can only do that by working with people in each theme who know the theme well and are engaging with the companies and looking at the company's financials to say, okay, well, actually, they're deriving a meaningful amount of revenue from this theme. Therefore, you know what? They're worthy of inclusion. So that is a key differentiator for us versus the other ETF providers. Obviously, active funds have their own processes. They will be engaging with a certain degree of experts, I suppose. That's for clients to sort of to ask. I think that the big question that we get from clients is, well, actually, it sounds like a lot of what you guys are doing is what the active guys are doing. We say, well, yeah, I mean, we're creating all of these from scratch. But the difference is we're a third of the cost.
which is a huge consideration. Let's be perfectly honest. A lot of the active funds within a thematic approach do require to conduct a huge amount of research, and therefore the costs to entry, the annualized costs of that are levied to the investor, are large. There's no doubt about it. You can't mix it up any other way. Whereas what I've discovered by having discussions with yourselves and the rest of your colleagues is your approach is very much to detail the purity of the revenue stream, the purity of the theme, which is exactly what you would expect an active fund manager to do. And so if you can deliver that at a much more attractive price point, which will hopefully feed back through to the returns that investors generate, then that has to be positive. Has the pandemic altered the theme? Has it changed the outlook, or is it just inevitable that this evolution is happening?
So I think I don't think it's changed it at all. I think if anything, it's accelerated. The pandemic has accelerated a lot of stuff, right? So it's obviously accelerated people's use of Zoom, which we're doing right now. It's accelerated anything digital, but it's also it's also done. People are spending way more time in their homes and therefore cooking all their meals at home, especially now that we're back in lockdown again.
Absolutely.
And so what's happened is, the shops have been stocking up on baking goods and lots of, additional groceries that maybe they didn't have so much of before. And what that has done I think is, and this again, some of this is kind of blue sky thinking, which is what we think we're good at. But what that means is think about what you are buying week in, week out, and throwing away week in, week out. What is it? It's food and food packaging.
Yeah.
You're not ordering a new t-shirt from Amazon every day, right? You're buying food every day. So it doesn't matter who you are, that's the thing that you're consuming on a daily basis, and that's the waste that you're producing on a daily basis. It's packaging, it's food waste. And I think people have become far more aware of this. Suddenly they're not in the office nipping out to buy a sandwich and they just toss it in the office bin. It's them that are having to carry this recycling and the compost and everything else outside. And so I think this has had a big impact there, and I think now is the moment for the government to make a move to sort of impose like a national sort of recycling and composting program and all that, which I think we're a year or two away from that, and I think that's something that needs to happen. But there are things like that, I think, that are now I think consumers are combining that sort of realization, look how much waste we're producing, look how much food I'm not eating or whatever, with also the news around deforestation. Everyone's seen David Attenborough's latest documentary, and all these pieces are coming together in people's minds to go, okay, we need to change our habits. And actually, we saw a reduction in. Some people like to say in the plant-based vegan world, they like to say, actually, there's been a reduction this year in meat consumption. I think that's more of a supply shock in the US and other places, more than a sudden change in consumer habits. I think we don't think that, other than this blip that we've had, there's been a major change in there. I think clearly a lot of people are talking about reducing their meat consumption, but it's not been a drastic drop, other than this supply shock that we've had this year, just because they haven't been able to sort of keep running these pig farms and things. But I think one of the most interesting areas, and I think this is of this theme entirely, I think the most interesting piece about it is that the food system, and this is coming back to this whole, it's not just conscious consumerism, we're talking about conscious investing now, right? So people like to invest their money into things that are not only going to give them a financial return, but can potentially have a more positive outcome for the world. We don't like to use the word impact too much, because we think that word is being massively abused by the asset management industry at the moment, just like ESG, just like sustainable. These words have been so badly abused. Greenwashing is not just being done by companies, it's being done by asset managers in a horrific way. And we think that's damaging, because it's luring people into a false sense of, actually, we're doing something good here. I'm doing my bit. No, you're not. And it's not because you don't intend to, it's because you're being sold something that isn't what it purports to be. So I think one of the key things about the food system, I can throw out some crazy numbers, between 20, it's about 26% of all human-made greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system, right? Of that, I think the staggering number as well is 14.5% of all human-made greenhouse gas emissions comes from animal agriculture specifically. And what people don't so 14.5% of all the emissions in the world that are human-made are just come from animal agriculture alone. And people don't realize that. And we're talking about the energy transition, the need to move away from coal. What people don't realize is that animal agriculture is so prevalent as a part of that. And what they also don't realize is that it's beef and soy that are causing all of the deforestation in the Amazon. It's no longer that we're chopping down the Amazon primarily to take high value timber out of there, right? They take the trees out, and then they take some of the high value trees out first. That's the first thing they do. But it's difficult to do that. It's a dense jungle. They then just burn it, and they burn it, and then they put the cattle to graze. And soy. You think about how much soy is being produced, and all the what's crazy is about 80% of soy that is grown is just grown to feed the bloody animals. So, most of, if we reduced our meat consumption, we wouldn't need to produce half as much food as we're actually producing.
Yeah.
So for all the people that can't afford to feed themselves and haven't got access to food, if we just stopped growing food to feed animals that the wealthier can eat, then there's plenty of food for everybody. So food is the single biggest lever that everyday consumers can pull to reduce their impact on the planet. So if you want to stop deforestation in the Amazon, substantially reduce the amount of beef that you're eating, right? Because demand for beef, even if you're eating locally produced beef, it's still raising the price. It's still, it has an impact, right? So, and the other thing is, if you think, okay, well, I bought a locally produced steak, from my farm down the road in Sussex, it's a farm shop. They've got a farm shop there. I go, yeah, but the emissions from that, it's not just the deforestation that you have with cattle ranching. You also have the methane emissions. They are a ruminant animal, right? So them and sheep have this process called enteric fermentation, which there's a special section in their stomach called the rumen. Basically, they're just constantly re-chewing and redigesting everything. So they produce a ton of methane, and pigs don't do that, and sheep and chickens don't do that. So they're not ruminant animals. So their emissions are far, far lower. They're still much higher than plant-based foods, but it's beef and lamb in particular that are causing the problem. 94% of the animal biomass on the planet is livestock. So if you take out humans, 94% of the animals that we have on the planet are animals that we're farming to eat. It's just madness. Humans were not designed to eat as much meat as we do now. If you go back and remember the conversations you had with your grandparents, meat was a special treat for them, once or twice a week if they were lucky. And it was a little bit. It wasn't a whole huge, T-bone steak. So, we've definitely lost touch with that side of things as consumers. And we see a massive change now back towards conscious consumerism, but it's not because they can't afford something. It's because they have a view on their health and also on their environmental impacts. But let's be clear, the food system and addressing that and some of your choices, both as a consumer, but also as an investor, are some of the biggest things we can do to actually have a more positive outcome for the planet, i.e. reducing deforestation in places like the Amazon, and also reducing our impact on the climate as a whole, because these are two different things. Climate change is the warming of the planet, which then has a whole load of secondary impacts, right? Deforestation is a very acute thing. It's like we're losing the biodiversity that makes our planet interesting. That also then has a knock-on effect on the climate. But they are two different things. And, so far investors have been very focused on climate change and how do we reduce emissions. They're not making the same connection with deforestation, which is ocean acidification and things like that, which are actually acute things that are also super, super important. And with our theme, sustainable future of food, it's all about making sure that forest risk commodity exposure within our fund and the companies that we capture are managed. So there's a whole process around that we can get into another time. But
and I would suggest from an investor's perspective, it's important to understand where the growing developments are within the world. And this is the beauty of thematic investing. It's not about pinpointing certain stocks or certain companies or certain sectors. It's about looking at the big overarching issues, problems that we've got in the world, and then investing in the human ingenuity to solve it. So it's very tangible. It's very understandable. It can really empower you as a person and empower your investment portfolio and your understanding of where you're invested. Because at the end of the day, we invest in order to make money, but it's important that we make money in the right way in order to benefit the population. And for me, this has been, as I said before, 2020 has been my own personal epiphany with regards to investment strategies and certainly thematic investing. And speaking to yourself and your colleagues again, it's been absolutely enlightening. And thank you for your time today. It's been hugely interesting, and I'm sure everyone else watching this has found it just as interesting. And if you have, like, subscribe, leave a comment. But finally, thank you very much, Stuart. It's been an absolute pleasure. and I'm sure we'll catch up soon.
Great. Thanks a lot for having me on.